Hello, everyone. I'm really honored and touched that Louise Mazanti is talking to me for the third time. Welcome to the show, Louise.
Thank you.
I do want to go through your bio briefly.
Okay. Yeah.
Louise Mazanti. So Louise is a psychotherapist who works with clients internationally on issues around womanhood, embodiment, relationship, sexuality, leadership, creativity, intuition, and consciousness. Louise works with individuals and couples who want to feel embodied, connected, and oriented towards the future. She calls this inner leadership. She's also a teacher who trains professionals. So, Louise, we had two conversations last autumn, 2022, and in October, we discussed the village and the nuclear family, as in traditional families, traditional relationships who had more of a they kept their roots in the local where they were brought up, and they had that natural connection with perhaps friends or family in the West as well. And what has been happening over the last 56 years in the West, which is moving to a city for employment or other reasons, as well as emancipation of men and women, and ability to work on themselves, spending more time to work on themselves rather than being part of communities, and which has been great at an individual level. And we acknowledge that perhaps when it came to being happy with your partner, you only had one person to fulfill all of your needs, and children didn't have that ability to socialize with a larger network. So we then moved on and talked to what, when somebody asks themselves that question, should I stay or should I go? Which is a question that people have been asking themselves more recently, in the last few decades, more frequently than before. We made the point that, yes, if a relationship is salvageable, as in not too unhealthy, then it's totally crucial to ask oneself that question. My point was that if it's not salvageable and you ask yourself that question, should I stay or should I go, your partner would feel on a trial, on a permanent trial period, and it's like setting your partner up for failure. So if you are in a long-term relationship and your relationship is salvageable, to ask yourself that question every day may not be wise. So we've agreed to talk about all of those relationships which are salvageable today. I don't know if you feel we should acknowledge what we mean by that, or whether that's obvious enough.
I think I want to start just a little step back, Francesco, because I think it's important to acknowledge that the nuclear family, as we've known it, is in a state of crisis. No matter no matter how well organized, how well structured, how well life is working, the nuclear family is under enormous pressure because our values are changing. The needs we have within a family structure are changing, because when the nuclear family was was created, it was a societal structure that worked in order to support capitalism, to support the workforce. That was why a family is structured like that. It's structured for survival in response to our social structures. So that has changed. We are living through a huge change in the paradigm, which means that what the family is supposed to provide, that organization of life is supposed to provide, has changed. Of course, it's there to bring up children, but there's also a whole family, and there's a couple within that that has needs for self-fulfillment, for growth, for happiness, for being on an individual path that's also about emotions and about meaning, that's about purpose, that's not just bringing up a family. And within that bigger picture, we can see that many people are struggling with, is this the right place for me? Is this a place where I can be fulfilled, where I can live a deeply meaningful life? So having said that, I guess that most people are somewhere inside asking themselves the question continuously. How can I be fulfilled in this life and still be in this marriage, this relationships, this structure? Is it making sense? And I think that sense making is a question that is important to touch on. How can we find meaning, purpose? How can we find sense within our relationships on an ongoing basis, when the relationship is not just new and exciting, but when there's a real life, when there's commitments, when there's children, when there's a lot of things that need to be nurtured within the relationship. And then we see that the compromises start, because life in relationship is a compromise. And I think the question is, what compromises are we willing to make in order to make the relationship work? That's kind of what I think is the essence of what we are touching. Should I stay or should I go? What compromises am I willing to make for the structure and for my own growth?
What comes up for me, Louise, is monogamy and non-monogamy. So I thought, for the sake of a 45 minutes discussion, we could focus on monogamous relationships, long-term monogamous relationships that are healthy enough and salvageable. So salvageable, I mean that there isn't too much resentment that has been built up, that even if good therapeutic work takes place, it's too late, because you're not able to let go of the resentment for that person. But given that you make a point about how important is not to sacrifice your life purpose, your individual flourishment, maybe we could briefly and concisely touch on the question of not making a mistake, not signing up for a monogamous relationship if that's not for you.
Yeah, I think you touch on something that's really important when you speak about the resentment. Because the resentment is something that builds in that tension that I spoke about between the deep personal needs for growth and fulfillment and the commitment to a working structure that a relationship and a life is. And within that, there's an ongoing tension of compromise. And if you're not compromising the right things, resentment will build. So when you say monogamy or non-monogamy, if a person feels that I absolutely need to have more sexual experiences or more partners than one, and that's a part of what is really, really important for me, and then they put themselves within a structure that is monogamous and is not fulfilling that, then the compromise that they are making is a compromise of something that's essential. And then a resentment will start building. At some point, the container of the relationship will start crackling and it will explode. If the compromise is not, if the person is not in alignment with the compromise they make. Because I think it's important to realize that we are always making compromises. Relationship is an ongoing compromise in the tension between those two. So it's so important when people come together and decide to have a serious relationship, to look at the values, to look at, are we aligned in our values? And are we aligned in the things that are essential for me? Will I be able to fulfill them within the container of the family, of the relationship? The compromises that I'm going to make, can I be conscious about them? And can I make compromises that are still sense-making, that are still fulfilling? Because the compromise is a given, but which ones are we going to make? And monogamy is one of the very big compromises, because if one person is genuinely monogamous and the other person is genuinely not monogamous, it's quite incompatible. And I think those conversations about, are we compatible? Like, are we really compatible in the deep values of what is important in this life? That can be a painful, but a really important conversation to have before we start being too attached, before it's too late. Because that's when the resentment will be built up. It is when people are not owning the compromise that they are making in the relationship, and they start blaming each other. And that's one of the really big mistakes that we see in relationships, is that people are actually not taking personal responsibility for, I have chosen to be in this relationship. I have chosen to be with this person. I did that out of choice. I take responsibility for the compromises that I am making. Most people start blaming each other when they're unfulfilled and unhappy, and when they're making compromises they don't want to do. But it really is so important to take that projection back and start owning self-responsibility for one's life. And that can be quite confronting. And it's easier to say it's my partner, they are wrong. That's what most people do, and then resentment starts building.
That's very rich. Where do I start? Start from my values, I guess. My parents are still alive and never separated, and they were very loving. And I felt that, my childhood and formative years, early teenage years were happy, formative in a good way for me. So that sort of blueprint stayed. And so a part of, and I suppose when I get to see studies and statistics on how really struggling children from single parents household are doing academically and later on in life, that sort of reinforces my bias for the traditional monogamy lifestyle or commitment, because at least children are deeply benefiting from it. So thank you for bringing the other 50% of it. But what about the individuals? The mother and father. So ideally, what the last few decades of modernity have brought is now father and mother can be fulfilled at an individual level. So not just for the sake of family.
Mm.
So I have this bias for marriage, if you like, for long-term relationship. But I'm increasingly asking myself that question in my private practice. Very soon after the birth of a baby, there is a huge crisis in couples that often leads to a separation and divorce. So at the moment, I feel a bit torn because I almost feel like encouraging couples I'm working with to consider the option of non-monogamy, to consider it very seriously, because to sign up for something that's long-term, and it's just very sad to witness so many couples that very soon after signing up for that, they're not working through the uncomfortable. So I suppose today I thought we can discuss that dilemma that people have. Should I stay? Should I go? And often they forget that the third option is, should I work through the uncomfortable? You made the point earlier on, the relationships are not about pleasure, they're about compromises. So I would add that working through the uncomfortable is somewhat there with the compromise.
Yeah, I think we're touching on something that I find really interesting, because it is in the tension between my personal fulfillment and the structures that I am applying my life within. Right there in that tension is a real growth, because I'm not advocating that it's just about my life path and my self-expression and my potential unfolding as if the structure didn't exist, as if other people didn't exist. This is not a path of the ego. My point is that it is right there in the middle where the compromises are being made that the huge potential for growth is. It is ideally within the relationship, within the family, within the structure, that we can apply that deep meaning, that we grow through the compromises we make. That's why it is so important to make the right compromises, because the right compromises will give us enough pushback on our ego that thinks that we are supposed to experience this and this and this and this, and put us right back to what's real, what's needed in life. What do we need to provide? What do we need to give and receive? How do we need to show up in service of life and in service of the people around us that can help us grow on our path? So in that way, I do absolutely see relationship as one of the most important ways to grow. So for me, the question is, how can I make the right compromises? And I would always say, absolutely work through the uncomfortable. It's far too easy to just go when things are getting tough and not receive the learning that is there by having a real look at each other and say, how did we get stuck here? What happened when, as you brought the example of young families, I see that a lot in my practice too, that when a child or two children arrive, intimacy stops working and our identity changes and the relationship changes. And that is a moment to look at each other and see the tension between those two and see, how can we find each other right there in the middle? How can we use our compromises, because both people are making compromises? How can we use them to grow together? Ideally, of course.
I wonder how big the problem is to do with asking yourself the question of what monogamy is in my and represents in my life, would represent in the long term. I wonder how much of that, whether that could provide a massive help. I suspect that it would do. So many assumptions are being made that if you are committing to a long-term relationship, it might have the best bits of the previous generations with the best bits of individual fulfillment. I feel there are too many individuals that are making that assumption. But it can't have the best bits of the past and the best bits of the present.
I think monogamy or non-monogamy is such a big conversation.
Mm-hmm.
But what I want to say about it is far too easy to think that I'm non-monogamous out of I want to say emotional laziness. If things get tough over here, I'll just go somewhere else. I'll have my need met here and here, and not show up for the compromises that make us grow, the compromises that develops our character. I'm not saying that non-monogamous is not a good idea in general, but it can be a quick fix to a lack of desire for growth. There can be a lot of growth in non-monogamy, absolutely, because it's a difficult territory to navigate. But it's not an easy fix for a relationship. If a relationship is struggling and the couple is discussing, oh, maybe we should open our relationship and think that that would help the problems, I'd say that's not a straightforward way to solve problems, because it's not about that. It's about we have lost touch with each other, not just how can we find it somewhere else, but how can we solve the things that made us lose touch with each other. And until that's fully explored, I would say never open up a relationship on basis of things are difficult right now. If we open it, it might be a solution. A relationship should only be open when things are good and it's a genuine desire within both partners that that's what they want.
I would agree. I think it's ideally is more of a question of having reached the place of maturity in your life when, if you do choose monogamy, you've considered what that is about. And once you've done that, that implies that you're not going to open up your marriage afterwards because you've already worked out that you believed in this. I think that leads beautifully to what we intended to discuss, which is if you fall in that category of individuals that took the question of, am I suitable for a monogamous long-term relationship seriously, and you are in a relationship that is not too unhealthy, so it's healthy enough and it's salvageable because there's not too much resentment that has been built up. Whether you come to people like us, couple therapists or not, what should you be doing? What is wise to do?
Yeah, I was just going to say, Francesco, come and see us, because it is so healthy to have an objective perspective, someone to step in and be a mirror of the dynamics that's going on. Because when people get into trouble, it's because the dynamics has shifted. That when people came together, there was one dynamics and it was working wonderfully. Then we start growing and life happens and the dynamic changes. And we get into patterns that are, of course, also fed by the past, by our past wounding, by our history. And that starts showing when we come together and commit to a serious journey. The wounds will come up, and to have someone reflect that back and mirror that back and help people see what's going on in their relationship is hugely helpful. I know you know that, but I'm saying it to the listeners.
Yes, I'm very self-conscious of self-promotion, but so is it healthy, Louise, to ask yourself the question, should I stay or should I go? Or shall we acknowledge the gender difference, whether women or men ask themselves that question more frequently?
Yeah. I'd say, yes, of course, it's healthy to ask yourself that question, because it's healthy to keep evaluating, what am I doing in my life? Am I in integrity with myself? And am I authentic? I want to say, am I living the life that feels right and aligned? But it's not about asking that question as oh, I'm on the edge of leaving my relationship all the time. That's not healthy. But it's healthy to keep checking in. How am I doing in my relationship? What are we doing together? Or how are we doing together? And this leads me to what I actually didn't get to say before about what should a couple do? Because I think a couple should always be aware. How are we doing emotionally? Are we connected? How are we doing intimately? Are we connected? How are we doing physically? How are we doing sexually? And just monitor. And that doesn't mean that we have to perform well on all aspects of a relationship all the time, because that's impossible. And again, coming back to the compromise, we go through things, our intimacy or our sex goes out the door for a while, but then it's about, okay, it's out the door right now. How can we come back once the wave has passed? And I think that's the most important thing for couples, is to be aware that a relationship and a sexual life does not feed itself. It has to be prioritized. It has to be nourished. We have to communicate and continuously check in. How am I doing? And how are we doing? How am I doing? How is my partner doing? So that we can change. It's not to ask the question, do I want to be here? But ask the question, am I showing up in a way that nourishes this relationship? Am I showing up in a way that nourishes myself in this relationship? Am I showing up for my partner? That's a different question than should I stay or should I go? Because that's in a way, it's a quite selfish question. And it's quite a limited question. And instead, I would say the question is, are we growing? Are we nourishing each other? Are we in connection? If we are not, what's in the way? And if we can't solve that, that's a place where you go and seek professional help. But it really is about connection. Are we in connection? Do we communicate? Are we close? Do we feel each other? Do we talk to each other? Do we know how we're feeling? These questions are very important to ask ongoing.
In our first podcast last September 2022, we both agreed that men have taken the first steps in their emotional growth in terms of becoming better listeners and being more empathically attuned. But all of the things you've said about nourishing the relationships, I feel that, traditionally women have been way more aware than men. And now with all the podcasts available and therapy has been used more commonly, even though men have taken the first step, and you were making a point that you would like women to acknowledge those first steps more frequently than they do. But on the other hand, even women have stepped up. So I do get women's disappointment with men, because men have stepped up. Women are also listening to podcasts and accessing therapy. So I very often get women approaching me regardless. I mean, it's mostly women that approach me for couple therapy, but more often than not, there's also women that say similar things to the one you've said. I feel that we're not nourishing our relationship, is not paying enough attention to it. And that can actually grow the resentment. That's when, perhaps, I'm generalizing here, that's perhaps where a woman could ask that question quite frequently. Should I stay or should I go? Because it's clearly not nourishing us.
I think many women are struggling with not feeling emotionally fulfilled. They feel a lack of presence. And I think we are feeling we are in this changing paradigm where values are changing, and men have, by and large, we're talking a little bit black and white, but men have been taking the role as providers, and it's very, very deep, and it's also a part of how the male brain, again, by and large, works. It's about creating and providing and building and nourishing the family in a very particular way. That's not emotional. It's more about structures. It's more about making money and providing for the family in that way. That's the old way. That's the old way. That men have held that part of the relationship, while women have held the more emotional part of the relationship. That's changing, and we are finding ourselves in this flux of expectations and needs. And as you say, men have begun to learn to be more emotionally attuned, to be more present, because I think what women need is actually its presence. It's what I see with so many of the clients that I'm working with. It comes down to that. Are they able to be present with each other? And there's this huge need for that moment of attunement. It doesn't mean we have to do everything together at all. It's actually very little that can do magic, which is there any moments available where there is that deeper contact, where there's presence, that is not about organizing or talking about or life happening out there, but there's just you and I, two partners, two people that love each other, that show up and say, hey, how are you? Again, as I said, check in with each other. How are you doing? How are we doing? And that checking in, that presence, that emotional attunement is something that men haven't been used to doing. It's a new, I want to say it's a new thing. And that's a deep nourishment that can feed a relationship. So it's not like there's a huge, massive change that's needed, but it's just the awareness of making oneself available. And I think men have not been aware of that, and they can also be quite emotionally uncomfortable with that presence, where it's not about fixing something, or it's not about talking about something, but it's just about being with what is. And what I see a lot is that men are not very comfortable with being with what is, because if the woman, and again, we're talking a little bit gender stereotypically here, but if the woman is bringing something emotional, he very often wants to rush in and fix it. Well, she doesn't need fixing. She actually just needs presence and being listened to, being understood. And that's enough. And I think that's a piece of work that's still ahead of men. They are beginning to be more emotionally attuned, and more of that will do wonders in relationship from women's perspective.
I feel really touched by your description of emotional attunement. It really speaks to how nourishing that can be. And I'm also quite self-conscious of my male attitude right now, because although a part of me feels really touched with that, my sort of probably male brain thinks, let's bring the conversation back to its structure, back to that question, should I stay or should I go? So if your partner is not nourishing the relationship and is refusing to come to couple counseling, has been refusing to come to couple counseling for years, perhaps it's already too late. Perhaps come to see a therapist on a one-to-one basis, because that therapist can give you some tips on to persuade your partner to attend a couple counseling consultation, and often that could persuade them to attend more sessions. Yes.
Yeah, no, the first thing I want to say is that if a relationship is not fulfilling, it's not good enough to say, I don't want to do anything about it. That's too lazy, and it's not taking responsibility. And I think that's my most important point, is to take responsibility for creating the relationship. you want to have. And men can tend to want to hide, to not show up in a space where they have to reveal their emotions. And it's because it hasn't been safe. You know, it's also women's responsibility to hold men's emotion in a safe way and not to criticize them when they're not as emotionally eloquent as women are. Women tend to also bulldoze over men because they're not doing it the right way. And I think that's a responsibility for women, is can we receive men when they actually try to step into the emotional space that we are longing for them to step into? So that's women's work. And for men, it's to come out of the habit of hiding and gather the courage to step up when it gets uncomfortable. And that means that both women and men need to be uncomfortable, because women need to be able to hold that. They're not going to have all their needs met. Their man is not going to be the perfect version of who they want him to be, but they have to be able to see who he is and if he is showing up. And the man has to be willing to take the responsibility and show up when it's uncomfortable, to be seen in the things that he's usually not sharing.
I'm not able to cite the studies that are backing up these huge generalizations, but you know, I'm well aware of them, and Jordan Peterson have made a good job of backing them up empirically. But let's put it this way: when men stereotype women's emotional vulnerability, they would refer to the tendency of having of going from negative emotions to positive emotions. And when women stereotype about men's emotional vulnerability, they say he shut down, it just shut down. The conversation was a non-starter, which speaks to what you were saying about men's tendency to hide. And it's kind of lazy. So I think, you know, I would like to encourage men and women to be very compassionate. It's a very, very tricky and sensitive and politically incorrect arena, but very often is these two very vulnerabilities that are at play when she asks him to engage in couple counseling. He often makes the wrong assumptions that she's being somewhat over emotional. And this is not going anywhere, this conversation. And he kind of feels overwhelmed, and he does shut down and hides. It doesn't give her the benefit of the doubt that if he does engage with that conversation, it would not be an over-emotional one. It probably shows up as somewhat overwhelming for him, just because for her, he's been refusing to engage with this for a long time. So it's hard for her to bring it up to his attention in a way that is, you know, calm and collected. It kind of, but often what I say to men is engage with these conversations, and you'll find out that you both self-regulate, and emotionally is going to feel much more manageable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Once you engage with it.
Yeah. I think we are touching on one of the key points of why many relationships they end when something could actually have been done if people have sought advice a bit earlier on. And the reason why men tend to resist that, and in a way I understand, because it can feel like a pressure if the woman says we have to go to couples counseling. It can feel like a pressure of both the woman actually wanting someone to side with her, that she's just kind of looking to bring in a little bit more heavy artillery to get her point across, where he feels threatened by, oh my God, now there's going to be two people that are just picking on me, and feels unsafe in that space because it's an emotional space where he's not naturally at home. So that's one part of it, that it can feel quite threatening and intimidating. And I do absolutely see couples that come where the partner, usually the woman that drags them into therapy, is actually wanting that she has a subconscious or conscious desire for someone else to see that she's right and he's wrong, and wanting someone else to tell him. So that's one aspect of it. Another aspect of it is that the moment that you start couples counseling, you start rocking the boat, because you start having the conversations that you're afraid of having. And the reason why you're afraid of having them is that conversations have consequences. You know, if we start bringing up the stuff that we usually keep down here, if we bring it up, we have to do something with it. So we rock the boat, which means that change is imminent. When you enter couples counseling, change is imminent. That's why you're there. So either it means something, I need to change, and people are, resisting change. And it also means that we'll have to look at, is this a healthy relationship? Do we want to continue? And of course, that's terrifying. So it's not like it's taking a risk. It's showing up for growth. It's showing up for facing reality. That's what it is when you enter that space. And sometimes it's easier to stay just, put your head down and stay under the radar and hope for the best. And I think, if we look at the difference between men and women, I think women, because there's so much growth happening in women these decades, it's like the feminine is really coming into, the inner feminine is coming into a different way of wanting expression and wanting power, wanting responsibility for her own life. So women are not prepared to endure their lives. They're not prepared to show up for relationships that are not really alive. So there is a huge kind of surge in women to change their lives and to evolve and to take responsibility, to be the one to decide for their lives themselves. And so they're doing that. And men tend to stay more, it's a generalization, but it's also what I see, that they don't really rock the boat until they really have a reason to do that. Men do not usually rock the boat of a relationship if it's kind of good enough. Good enough is not good enough for women as much as it is good enough for men. So men tend to stay in relationships where there's no real vitality, where there's no real life, unless they have someone else to go to. And it's a generalization, but it's also absolutely a tendency, because it's emotionally more safe, whereas women will tend to be more critical, and also they have much more resources to do life on their own than men actually have, because women have this ability to create connection and get nourished emotionally in many ways, where men don't have as many sources for emotional connection and emotional fulfillment than women have. So women are the ones that usually tend to rock the boat if the relationship is not working. So of course, the men are going to feel threatened when the woman says, we need therapy, because then he knows he's actually in trouble.
Yes, like you're saying, by then for her, making the next step of moving on is not as daunting, because she's already created for herself. Well, not that she was planning to do that, but naturally her instinct and drives her to create this connection and networks where moving on from him is not necessarily that daunting, whereas for him it is. This links beautifully with that fact: have you considered monogamy carefully enough? Because unconsciously, if you haven't, you would ask him to do couple therapy, and he says no 2 or 3 times, and you give up and you start living your life, and then it gets to a point where you have a lot of resentment for him, and also you're kind of independent by then emotionally, because you've been spending quite a bit of time connecting to other individuals. So there is a big imbalance at that point. You know, in our practices, we do see that it's mostly women who reach out to us, and she has much less to lose. But again, my question mark is, these people haven't been in a real monogamous relationship because he's been too sort of lazy about it, hasn't revitalized and nourished the relationship, hasn't engaged with difficult conversation, and she's unconsciously sort of drifted away. And by now she's ready to move on. And they haven't done the third bit, which is, should I stay? Should I go? Or should I walk through the uncomfortable?
Yeah.
So we are really generalizing, but I do want to say largely men don't engage with that difficult conversation. But I feel like saying it's also women's responsibility to not to give up on. It's too important. Don't start drifting away from him. You know, if you really believed in monogamy, if your values are aligned with monogamy, then it's your responsibility to drag him to couples therapy, to book a one-to-one, or to, well, let's leave it there.
Yeah, but I think I want to add that I always say to couple that a relationship is a whole. It's a whole, but it consists of 2 halves, of 50% each. And each of the relationship owns their 50%. And it is too easy to just point at the other one and saying, you're not providing, I am unhappy, I'm not receiving what I want to receive. But we really have to look at ourselves first and ask, am I providing the right container? Am I actually receiving? And am I giving? How am I showing up in the relationship? And that conversation within ourselves is important to have first. Like, if the woman is unhappy with the level of communication, she can ask herself, how am I communicating? And am I inviting in communication, or am I inviting in communication that makes him feel safe? And all these little intricacies is something that we absolutely have to look at when we start drifting away, because it's far too easy to just look at the other one and say, well, you're always on your phone. Why are they always on their phone? Or why is work taking up so much space? And that's a conversation the couple needs to have within each other. How are we nourishing the 100%? And far too often it's easier to point in the other direction.
Yes, so I would say, regardless of gender, finally, I'm happy to say that I don't need to generalize. Regardless of gender, to be convinced that you're in the right is a very common factor that leads to a big relationship crisis. It could be that you have a degree in psychology, and you feel like you know relationships patterns inside out, and that meant that you are now convinced that your other half, whether it's a man or a woman, is the wrong party.
I think one of the big problems and one of the big illnesses, and that's for both men and women and for everyone, is that we're not very good at listening. We just don't hear what each other is saying. And I see it often in the couples that I work with, that one of them is speaking and the other one is already, instead of listening to what is I'm talking about couples that are having difficulties, the other one is instead of listening and receiving what's being said, they're already preparing their counter. How am I going to counter that to show that I'm in the right and they're in the wrong? And it's the listening and the receiving that makes the huge difference, because that's where the real connection is. That's where I'm connecting with what's real for my partner. If I'm just busy with telling them why I'm unhappy and why I'm in the right, we're not going to get anywhere. And that's the same for both men and women. We just have different ways of doing it. One is kind of stereotypically under talking and one is over talking. But none of them are hearing what the other one is saying. And I think that's the point that really creates connection. It's when we allow in what's being said and let it percolate through our system and let us feel into, right, they're sharing that they're having this experience. Let me just run through my system what's true about that and what's not. So maybe I can take responsibility for part of it. Maybe it's not all of it. Instead of kind of just blank, like pushing back that couples tend to do. The couples that I see that I have a very strong sense that they will make it and just grow from what they're going through is when they're able to reflect on what's being said and take self-responsibility for part of it. I want to say that is really the key to moving past difficulties in a relationship, is when you're able to hear your partner, reflect, take self-responsibility, and come back.
It's so multi-layered and complex, because at one point in the discussion, both yourself and myself were emphasizing the importance of therapy. So whether you end up dragging the other half to therapy, why not? But your point is like, what's happening in the meantime? If you end up convincing yourself that you're right and they're not coming, it just becomes about couple therapy then. Okay, he's not even coming to couple therapy, so he's definitely wrong, or she's definitely wrong.
Yeah, that's a stalemate that most couple they end in, and they really believe that's how it is, and there's no growth.
As opposed to listening, because your point was the alternative to that is to really listen.
Yeah, because there is no growth. A relationship is not going to grow. And even as an individual person, we are not going to grow if we are only looking to have our bias and our experience, have it confirmed. If that's what it's about, everything will stay the same and we will not evolve, because the way that we actually evolve is by external stimulation that comes our way, in whichever way life throws that at you, and we respond to it. We kind of align with our own internal values, with our inner leadership, and respond to whatever is coming our way. That's how we grow. And so if our partner is throwing something at us, it's not just about pushing it back so everything can stay the same, but it's about letting it impact us so that we can feel into, right, how does this resonate within me? What do I need to push back? And what do I actually need to use as a self-reflection to evolve and to grow? That is, for me, the hallmark of a healthy relationship, is to be able to really do that, to feel into what's being said, what is needing to be heard, and how am I aligning with that? Where is that? What's the truth here? What is the reality, instead of what's my bias and what's my ego saying that it wants to have confirmed? That there's no growth in that.
Mm-hmm. We're approaching the last 5 or 6 minutes of this podcast. I'm not sure where you think it's the best direction to go for this final part. just want to acknowledge the fear. Often there is a fear that if, clearly he seems to say that he's right. Clearly he's trying to prove his point that I'm wrong, so I'm going to push back. Or clearly she's saying we should go to couple therapy. That means that she's making a point that we are in crisis. I'm going to push back because I'm fearful that she's trying to prove that there is a crisis here. That the fear is definitely very often a big factor. You're pushing back not just for the sake of winning the argument. You're pushing back because there's so much at stake. Oh my God, is the other person? They look so serious and so upset, and they are trying to prove their point. They're really trying to say that, look, couple counseling is needed, it's gonna be essential. Wow, I'm gonna push back because I'm gonna just say no. I haven't been that bad. We're not in crisis. What's the big deal?
I think that viewpoint is a lack of psychological maturity. That's what it is. It's a lack of willingness to grow. And again, psychological maturity is it's the ability to discern what's mine and what's not mine. And what's mine, I need to take responsibility for it. In plain words, clean up my shit, clean up my hang-ups. And that's required for a relationship to grow over time, is that we come into that psychological maturity. And that's what couples counseling does, that it invites that in both for both partners. It is the ability to reflect and take responsibility. And again, I know I'm laboring the point here, but that's the only way that we can grow. It's uncomfortable because our old ways will be challenged. That's how it is. But all growth comes with a lack of comfort, because we step into the not known. We're so used to have our opinions and values to navigate by the kind of how we tell ourselves things are and what we tell ourselves about who I am. But there's no growth in that. And the ability, psychological maturity is actually, it's the ability to continuously assess, where's my integrity? Where's my values? What's needed from me in this moment? How do I need to respond when I'm actually aligned with my own values? Most people don't do that. That's a blank statement. I take that back. But by default, we want to avoid it because it's difficult and it's confronting. So by default, we step back for being in consciousness about our own behaviors. And that's what's needed. And that's why, to me, relationship is such an incredible container for growth, because it will push our buttons. It will show where we're not in consciousness. It will show when we're not in integrity. All that comes up. And that's the golden thread of it, is that it helps us grow because it exposes everything that needs growing.
Self-responsibility is really, really, really crucial. And as part of that, the responsibility not to drift away. Because I do agree on the maturity to discern what's mine from what's yours. Also, I don't underestimate the fear factor, because if you're drifting away, that might mean that you're having chats in the cafe about how non-supportive your partner has been, and that you've been asking yourself the question, should I stay or should I go? And you were talking about reinforcing bias, getting a bias being reinforced. And of course, if you're looking for friends that love you and potentially side with you, you're going to find those friends. You're going to find those cafe conversations in which you're going to hear you deserve better than this. And then when you are asking, will you come to couple counseling? The other half can tell if you are coming from a self-righteous perspective. The other half can tell that, you know, you seem outraged with them, that they are really sort of failing you. And don't be surprised if they're fearful and non-engage in that discussion. So the non-drifting away part, I think, is crucial. You don't want to ask that question, come to couple counseling, when you feel very resentful and think that you're 100% right and they're 100% wrong.
Yeah.
Because that's not a good place to ask that question.
Yeah. And maybe from what you're saying here, Francesco, there's a point that I want to make about the one that feels resistance to coming to couples counseling. Because if the person that is outraged, if the person that's dragging them to counseling is not showing the ability to self-reflect, I'm going to say herself, themselves, yeah, then of course it's going to feel really, really threatening. Because then there's a person left with, my partner is really, really dissatisfied, and now we're going into a space where that dissatisfaction is going to be all over the place, and we haven't experienced that they're able to self-reflect. Of course, it's going to feel threatening. Then we rather want to avoid it. So that's why, you know, I'm making the point about the 50% and about the person that's unhappy in the relationship really needs to ask themselves, have I made the right conditions for my partner to step up? What's my responsibility here?
Have I earned this trust? Have I earned their trust? By showing self-reflection, you are earning the other half trust. And it's a big leap of faith to go to couple counseling with somebody that hasn't earned your trust.
Yes, that's it. Yeah, well summarized. Yeah.
Well, Louise, that was longer than usual, but nevertheless very alive.
Great. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day.
You too.